Previously, earlier, I was mentioning a fitna, a tribulation. Of course, there is another tribulation, a man known as Ali Mirza, engineer from Pakistan, whom in the coming days I will refute thoroughly, inshaAllah ta'ala, a man whose manhaj is deviated from the way of Ahlul Sunnah wal Jama'ah. But another individual for today's live stream is an individual whom people refer to as Chuff Chuff. Now, even though they refer to the man as Chuff Chuff, even though they have been referring to him as Chuff Chuff, his name, the name that he goes with is Haq Badshah Sarkar. This man is a man who claims to be a healer, and he comes every year to the UK and is hosted by many people from within the community, to the point that some people, they think that this deviated man is one of the community leaders. Of course, this peer culture is a culture which has deviated many people in contradistinction to the way of Ahlul Sunnah wal Jama'ah. The peer culture today has become a culture where people simply kiss the hands and the feet of men that they claim are spiritual, and then those people fleece the public for their wealth, and they also carry out various types of abuses within the community. But what type of people fall victim to this Chuff Chuff? The answer is that there are some people who sometimes suffer because of physical ailments, health problems, and because of those ailments and health problems, they become desperate for a cure. They look for a cure. They go around looking for a quick cure, rather than resorting to a change of lifestyle. Perhaps their diets are affecting their mind and their body, their lifestyle in terms of lack of exercise, lack of walking, lack of fresh air and lack of sunlight and fresh water. Their minds are affected, and because of this they have physical and mental ailments, many of them. And because of this also they resort to spiritual healers. Those spiritual healers claim that they can cure something with a blow. Now, from the Sunnah of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam is a shifa from Al-Quran Al-Kareem. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala states, وَنُنَزِّلُ مِنَ الْقُرْآنِ مَا هُوَ شِفَاءٌ وَرَحْمَةٌ لِلْمُؤْمِنِينَ وَلَا يَزِيدُ الظَّالِمِينَ إِلَّا خَسَارًا. That this Quran we reveal from Al-Quran Al-Kareem, that which is shifa. What is shifa? A cure for the believers. And it does not increase the unbelievers, the wrongdoers, except in loss. Why? Because they do not take guidance and shifa from Al-Quran Al-Kareem. But rather than resorting to a person reciting Al-Quran Al-Kareem correctly, what do people do? They resort to the likes of this Chuff Chuff. And Chuff Chuff, when he arrives to the UK, he fills up halls with people who claim that they are from Ahlul Sunnah wal Jama'ah. In fact, there is not only Chuff Chuff, there are other claimants to being faith healers who come to the shores of the UK and are actually promoted by people within the masajid, by people from within the community, who then take advantage of ill people, people who may have mental disabilities, people who have physical disabilities. And this has become a common problem, to the point that many people are not actually pulling up the likes of Chuff Chuff and taking him to task for what he is doing. Of course, in Pakistan, many of the ulama did not take Chuff Chuff to task until recently. A journalist, he approached Chuff Chuff and even attended his center, and he refuted him with regard to his faith healing. But this is a cultural cancer what I would refer to this is a cultural cancer within many communities, within the Indo-Pak community. We have a cultural cancer with regard to fake healers. These fake healers take advantage of vulnerable people, and the public do not know how to carry out actual spiritual healing. How do we carry out actual spiritual healing? Spiritual healing is done through Al-Quran Al-Kareem. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says in Al-Quran Al-Kareem, as I mentioned, that we reveal from this Quran that which is shifa. And from the shifa, which is a cure, is Al-Mu'awwidhatayn. What is Al-Mu'awwidhatayn? Al-Mu'awwidhatayn is reciting Surah Al-Falaq and Surah Al-Nas. As-Sayyidatu Aisha radiyallahu anha states that before the revelation of Al-Mu'awwidhatayn, Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wasallam would recite various ad'iyah, various supplications and adhkar, litanies. But when Surah Al-Falaq and Surah Al-Nas were revealed, he left reciting other things in abundance and would simply recite these two surahs of the Quran and blow them on the palm of his blessed hands, and then wipe the face and the entire body prior to going to sleep. This was done by Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and that is from the Sunnah. Similarly, reciting Ayatul Kursi, that we know from the famous hadith of Sayyiduna Abu Hurairah radiyallahu anhu, narrated in the Sahih of Imam al-Bukhari, that anyone who recites Ayatul Kursi, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala places a guardian angel to protect them from throughout the night until the morning. Now, abandoning the Sunnah and adopting bid'ah, adopting innovations in the deen, is from the hallmarks of khasara, of being at a loss. Abandoning the teachings of Al-Quran Al-Kareem and abandoning the teachings of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and then resorting to faith healers who do not actually recite Al-Quran Al-Kareem. You see, if this Chuff, whom they refer to as Haq Badshah Sarkar, was actually reciting the Quran, Al-Quran Al-Kareem, reciting it and then blowing on the patients, then we would say that he is actually following the Sunnah of reciting Surah Al-Fatiha, like the story of the man who was stung by a scorpion, and the Sahabi radiallahu anh recited upon him, blew upon him, and this affected the ruh, which leads to physical cures also. To elaborate on that, Ibn al-Qayyim al-Jawziyah in his book Zadul Ma'ad, there is a segment of Zadul Ma'ad which is a Tibbun Nawawi, a famous book. In that segment, he mentions that ailments start with spiritual illnesses, and then later they develop into physical illnesses. In the early stages, if a person recites the Quran with the ruqyah, he blows, that leads to the curing of the spiritual ailment, which will then not develop into a physical ailment. So catching the ailment in its early developmental stages, in its embryonic stages, is essential by reciting Al-Quran Al-Kareem for shifa. So reciting the Quran and blowing the Quran upon the people is from the Sunnah and established from the Sunnah. Later, when those ailments become physical ailments, then a person must resort to medicine also. So medicine is essential in Islam. Al-Imam Muhammad bin Idris al-Shafi'i famously said that a person should not live in a locality where there is no tabib, where there is no doctor, and where there is no alim. There should be someone for the deen who can answer your questions, and similarly there should be someone who can cure you from physical ailments. So ruqyah is from Al-Quran Al-Kareem and from the Sunnah. But Chuff Chuff and the likes of Chuff Chuff in the peer culture, you see, we live in an age of extremes. You have the deviant Mirza engineer. This Mirza engineer is at the other extreme of deviancy. He denies, in fact, he insulted a Shaykh Abdul Qadir al Jilani radiyallahu anhu, and even made a mockery of a Shaykh Abdul Qadir al Jilani radiyallahu anhu, and giving a similitude of the Iron Dome with a Shaykh Abdul Qadir al Jilani radiyallahu anhu. This insult to a Shaykh Abdul Qadir al Jilani radiyallahu anhu, the byproduct of his afkar, is the other extreme. And at one extreme we have the likes of Chuff Chuff. Chuff Chuff, people who fleece people for their money and for their frailties and their disabilities, and take advantage of those people. But at the other end we have people who deny any spiritual healing. These are the two extremes. And Pakistani society has already been polarized. Similarly in India and Bangladesh, there is a polarization in everything, from the rich and the poor, from the politicians and the people. But similarly, between those who act upon the Sunnah of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, which is the middle way, you have people on the outskirts of the Ahl Sunnah, those who claim to be spiritual guides in this day and age. And at the other extreme, you have the likes of Chuff, the likes of Mirza engineer, who misguide the people with regard to real Awliyaullah as-Salihun, the people of Allah, and make a mockery of Awliyaullah as-Salihun. So we have Awliyaullah as-Salihun, the pious awliya, who were actual ulama. Remember, many of the places which people visit today, those places where pious people are buried, those pious people were people who taught Al-Quranul Kareem and the Sunnah of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam. What is the proof of that? That many of our asanid, chains of narration, they go through the likes of those ulama who are buried in Pakistan and India today. People who taught Al-Bukhari. For instance, one of the best manuscripts of Sahih al-Bukhari, of Imam al-Bukhari rahimallahu ta'ala, was preserved by Radiyuddin, who was As-Saghani, Radiyuddin As-Saghani, a linguist from where, a lexicographer, who was born in the city of Lahore. In which year did he pass away? In the year 650 Hijri. 650 Hijri. Today we are in the year 1445. So you can imagine this. He passed away nearly 800 years ago. An alim of the deen who preserved the Sahih of Imam Bukhari was from Lahore. Similarly in Lahore, you have Ali bin Uthman al-Hajwari, rahimahullah ta'ala, the author of Kashf al-Mahjub, someone who was linked to Al-Imam al-Qushayri, the author of Risalatul Qushayriya, a major alim of the deen. These people not only taught the Arabic language, they also taught subjects like lexicography. They taught the ahadith of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam with ilm, and they acted upon their amal. So for the likes of Mirza engineer to take advantage of the cultural problem prevalent within Pakistan, throughout India, the cultural problem of fake healers, the cultural problem of the peer culture, is to misguide people with regard to the real teachings of Ahl Sunnah wal Jama'ah, the teachings of the likes of Imam Abu Hamid al-Ghazali rahimahullah ta'ala, the teachings of ulama prior to Abu Hamid al-Ghazali, of as-Salaf as-Salihun. So Chuff Chuff and Ali engineer Mirza, these are two people of two extremes. Chuff Chuff, when he comes to the UK, he carries out gatherings which are attended by hundreds of people who are vulnerable, and claims by standing up he will blow down the microphone and people will be cured. This, of course, is a scam. He is scamming the people and misguiding the people. As I mentioned, that the cure for the ailments of people is found in two things. One is medicine, that people need to resort to medicine. Medicine is from the Sunnah of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And secondly is the shifa found in Al-Quran Al-Kareem and the Sunnah of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, as I mentioned earlier, Al-Mu'awwidhatayn, Surah Al-Falaq and Surah Al-Nas, Ayatul Kursi, but also simple remedies like the drinking of ajwa, the eating of ajwa, the drinking of zamzam water, and the eating of herb, those foods which are beneficial and nutritious, and abandoning unhealthy lifestyle. Abandoning an unhealthy lifestyle is essential for a cure. How does one find a spiritual guide in this day and age? This is a common question which people ask. Al-Imam Ibn Ata'illah Al-Iskandari rahimallahu ta'ala, he mentions that when a person proposes to the daughter of a king, he must have a standard himself. You do not go and propose to the daughter of a king with clothes which have excrement. So he states that a person who is looking for a spiritual guide, he must better himself to a standard by which he is able to find such a spiritual guide. What do we have in this day and age? People who do not know ahkamus salah, they do not know how to pray properly, they do not know shurutus salah, arkanus salah, they do not even know the dua qunut in the prayer, in the salatul witr, they do not know nawaqidul wudu, what invalidates your wudu, they do not know basic arkanul Islam. They have years of qada of prayer, years of qada. They have the qada of zakat, they miss their zakatul amwal, they do not pay their zakatul amwal. And similarly, we have people who miss fasting in the month of Ramadan, yet they claim that they are finding a spiritual guide. When they do find a spiritual guide, what do they have? Perhaps the spiritual guide will visit the country once a year. Perhaps they will go to visit the spiritual guide. Sometimes the misguidance is to the point that many of them, they actually do sajda to the peer. This is found that there are people who actually carry out sajda to their spiritual guide. Some of them are so misguided, they will do sajda to the graves. Some of them will do tawaf of the graves. Some of them are misguided to the point that they do not rely upon Al-Quran Al-Kareem for their shifa. They perhaps will go to the person for a ta'weed and believe that ta'weed alone will cure them, not resorting to acting upon the deen of Al-Islam, which is praying the 5 daily prayers, as well as the women wearing hijab. So many times you have the women not dressing appropriately and approaching the Pir Sahib. The so-called Pir Sahib will not command the women to dress modestly in accordance with the Sharia of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. In fact, some of them will wear makeup when approaching the Pir Sahib. They will not cover their faces in accordance with the law of Allah. They will not dress appropriately, and they become misguided. Sometimes and many times the Pir Sahib, a person will spend decades with such a guide, they will not even learn the basic sifat of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. They will not even learn the attributes of Allah. There are so many people in our community, they have spent years and years with a Pir. The Pir has not instructed them even in the basic sifat of Allah. And even if he does, many times the person will misguide them in other aspects of the deen of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So in this day and age, a person must be careful in terms of isolation where women are isolated with the peer, where incidents may occur. Khalwa between a man and woman, which is haram in the Sharia of Allah. If the woman is not related to you, you cannot have khalwa with that woman. But likewise, the misguided peers, they will misguide people with regard to ilm. So many of the murids, people who are students, are never encouraged into entering al-ilm al-sharif, to studying ilm correctly. So many of them have many vulnerabilities. And as I mentioned, one of those vulnerabilities is the case of women. What is a ghair mahram? A mahram, firstly, a mahram is someone you can never marry. A ghair mahram is someone you can marry. It is impermissible for a man to be alone with a woman who is ghair mahram, a man and woman in isolation. A man cannot stay with her alone behind closed doors. Totally prohibited in the Sharia of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And Chuff Chuff peer is an ailment of an illness in our community. Such an ailment that if it is not rooted out, if the bid'ah in our community is not rooted out, you will only have the likes of Ali Mirza engineer and the misguided people growing in number, because they misguide people with regard to the real meaning of tasawwuf, the real meaning of real Sufi guides. In this day and age, a person does not need to take bay'ah with a person. It's not essential. What is essential is firstly in aqeedah to have correct belief. After correct belief, firstly you cannot blind follow, you cannot do taqleed in aqeedah of a modern person. When you follow the Quran and Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, that is not deemed taqleed. If you ask someone, why do you believe in this, and he responds with a verse of the Quran, that is not taqleed. If you ask them, why do you believe in this, and they respond with a hadith of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, that is not taqleed. Taqleed is that when your peer becomes misguided, you become misguided with him. That is real taqleed. That is totally impermissible. We have false peers within the UK informing their murids that taqleed in aqeedah is permitted. This position has never been established in the books of ilm al-kalam. That taqleed, meaning it's qawl marjuh, it's not permissible to do taqleed in aqeedah of these individuals. So the first step to guidance is having the correct belief, the belief of Ahl Sunnah wal Jama'ah. The second step to guidance is following one of the four madhahib, al-madhahib al-arba'a. You either follow the Hanafi school, or the Shafi'i school, or the Maliki school, or the Hanbali school in your fiqh positions, following one of the schools of fiqh. And then when it comes to tasawwuf, a person takes guidance from the works of those ulama who have passed away, like Ihya Ulum al-Din of Imam Abu Hamid al-Ghazali, or Tanbih al-Mughtarrin of Imam Abdul Wahhab al-Sha'rani, and these type of books. A person increases in istighfar and salawat and salam upon Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam. In this day and age, as Imam Abu al-Abbas al-Mursi rahimahullah ta'ala states, in akhir al-zaman, spiritual guides will be difficult to find, meaning the person needs a certain level of qualification to have a superb Sufi guide. But to reach that level of qualification, the means of attaining that is through iltizamu sharia, following the sharia, which is only according to one of the four madhabs, and then increasing in salawat and salam upon the best of creation, sallallahu alaihi wa alihi wasallam. This is such a guide that Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wa alihi wasallam said, "Man ra'ani fil manami faqad ra'a al-haq." Whoever saw me in a dream, he has indeed truthfully observed me. And وَمَنْ رَآنِي فِي الْمَنَامِ فَسَيَرَانِي فِي الْيَقَظَةِ. Whoever observes me in their sleep, he shall observe me in a wakeful state. Authentic Sahih Hadith. This means Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wa alihi wasallam is the ultimate guide for the people, even in Akhirul Zaman, in this time. Following the Sunnah of Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wa alihi wasallam, and then increasing your salawat and salam upon the best of creation is your guide in this day and age. A person does not need a peer, because the peer culture today is corrupted. In fact, you have people who are not ulama claiming to be peers, but they can fool the general public that they are ulama, but they will avoid sitting with real ulama. Some of them cannot even recite a page from Sahih al-Bukhari and explain the page from Sahih al-Bukhari. Some of them will not know the Quran with qira'atu hafs, with tajweed. Many of them will not be able to even give a fiqh ruling, a ruling correctly from a madhab. This person is not a guide. A person who does not have these basic qualifications is not a guide. But even if a person is able to do that, they must fulfill the criteria as set out by the likes of Imam Abdul Wahhab al-Sha'rani rahimahullah ta'ala, which are found in his book Tanbihul Mukhtarreen. A person should read that book, Tanbihul Mukhtarreen. The Talabatul Ilm should read that book. The ulama, the mashayikh should sit down and read that book with their students, so we know the guidelines of a real person who follows the way of as-salafu salihun, the pious predecessors. That book is full of the conditions that are needed for a person to guide people. If a person claims to be a guide today, a Sufi guide, he must fulfill those conditions which are set out in Tanbihul Mukhtarreen. This is why I mentioned to many of those who claim to be peer up and down the UK that when you interact with me, I will bring up those conditions of Imam Abdul Wahhab al-Sha'rani. This is our right. Meaning the haqq of al-ilm is that you fulfill those conditions. If you make a claim today of being al-Ghawth, you claim to be al-Qutb, you claim to be Abdal, you claim to have a spiritual rank, then we will take you and measure you in accordance with the conditions laid down by Awliyaullah as-Salihun, like Imam Abdul Wahhab al-Sha'rani rahimahullah ta'ala. If a person makes a claim, he will be tested according to that claim. Wal-iyadhu billah. So, Chuff Chuff, when he comes to the UK, our public must be warned with regard to the scam, the fleecing that is occurring. People need guidance on looking after their health. They need guidance with regard to nutrition. They need guidance with regard to their mental health. They need guidance with regard to Al-Quranul Kareem and taking cure from Al-Quranul Kareem, taking the shifa from Al-Quranul Kareem. Now, many of the huffaz, the memorizers of the Quran, they worry with regard to reciting ruqya on the sick people. They should not desist from reciting ruqya on the sick people. They should recite ruqya upon the people who are sick in accordance with the sunnah and the guidance of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Additionally, when you have ruqya recited upon you, so many people, they take their women folk to the spiritual healers. And when they take their women folk to the spiritual healers, firstly, the women are not dressed in hijab. Some of them, they wear makeup. and many times they leave the women isolated with the peer. And this leads to the scandals that we hear about in our community. So many scandals that occur between the peer, the spiritual guide, and the murid. But that can be deterred if our public was educated in terms of the deen of Islam. That everyone today who complains about an abuse case, well, you should have known the Sharia of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. This is with regard to adults. They should know with regard to the Sharia of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. What does the Sharia of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala permit? What does the Sharia of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala forbid? For instance, women wearing inappropriate clothing, revealing clothing in front of the Pir Sahib. Totally haram. The woman should be wearing an abaya, a loose overgarment that covers the contours of the body, and be wearing scarves that cover the entire hair, as well as a face veil. And if there is no need to go in front of this so-called Pir, the women should not actually be meeting these Pirs. But some of the men folk, they take their women to spiritual healers, and it leads to abuse cases across the country. Not only within the UK, but across the entire Muslim world, wherever this may occur. So there are guidelines laid out by the Sharia of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala for a reason. And Chuff Chuff Pir is just one ailment of the Pir culture. This Pir culture today, the Wahhabi movement needs the false Pirs to validate itself. Let me repeat that again. The Wahhabi movement, the Najdi movement, the pseudo-Salafi movement requires the Pir cultural movement to validate its claim of bid'ah and shirk upon Ahl Sunnah wal Jama'ah. As long as there is a promotion of this false Pir culture, Wahhabism will grow. Because when you have bid'ah, when you have innovation in the practices of people, when you have lack of iltizam, lack of application of Sharia, when you have the proliferation of ignorance amongst the masses, when you have these cultural problems, then a person claiming to follow the Quran and Sunnah, people will follow him because he is pointing out an internal cancer which is found in the body of those cultural Muslims. Those cultural Muslims who may prostrate to a Pir, cultural Muslims who have a Jahil Pir. Sometimes they may stay with the Jahil Pir for decades and they will not realize he's actually a Jahil. He's a person who is actually very ignorant. Some of them are very ignorant and do not fulfill the shurut of an actual guide. And as I mentioned the work of Al-Imam Abdul Wahhab al-Sha'rani, Tanbih al-Muqtarrin, but he has another work, Mawazin al-Qasirin min Shuyukhin wa Muridin. And Al-Imam Sidi Ahmad Zarruq, rahimahullah ta'ala, he has Uddatul Murid Sadiq, preparing the truthful Murid. Never mind a truthful guide. By the way, there are always Awliyaullah Salihun. I would want to refute here some of the Wahhabis. I will refer to them as Najdi. Why? Because they object to people referring to them as Wahhabi. I will say Najdi. Addressing some of the Ahlul Najd, or the Najdis, not necessarily the people in Najd, meaning those who adopt Najdi creed, that some of them deny that there are Awliyaullah as-Salihun in every day and age. Awliyaullah as-Salihun exist in every day and age. There is no doubt on this. La shakka wa la rayb. When Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, Ala inna awliya Allahi la khawfun alayhim wa la hum yahzanun. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala alerts us to a group of people known as Awliya Allah in the Quran. This group of Awliya Allah, included amongst them are the Abdal, the 40 Abdal in Biladu Sham. This is something established in authentic hadith. But that is a subject for another time. But there are awliya in every day and age, but there is a distinction between a wali of Allah and someone man yatasaddaru, someone who comes out to claim that they lead people in tasawwuf. Two different things. You can have a wali, he doesn't come out necessarily claiming he is guiding the people. But anyone who claims that they are giving spiritual guidance to people will be tested according to the criteria set out by awliyaullah salihun. That is the purpose of mentioning this. There are awliya in every age, there are abdal. But for someone to claim that they are guiding the people, they must fit the criteria of as-salafu salihun, and that is laid out in Tanbihul Mukhtarreen. In fact, I would even recommend the book to our listeners who come from the pseudo-Salafi persuasion. Those listeners who come from the pseudo-Salafi persuasion, I would recommend the book to you, Tanbihul Mukhtarreen. You must read this book. It has all the shurut and the conditions that a true guide has. So, how do the false guides keep the people within the prism or within a prison of the claim of being awliyaullah salihun? One of them is by giving out free ta'aweedh. Ta'aweedh is a piece of paper, you write something upon the piece of paper, you hang it on the neck, and a person believes they are protected. Now, I am not necessarily discussing at this point ta'aweedh and the legitimacy of ta'aweedh. That's a different discussion. The legitimacy of ta'aweedh is discussed in the books of al-fiqh. They discuss in the books of jurisprudence what is ta'aweedh, what is valid, what is invalid. That is not the point. This distribution of ta'aweedh culture is such that people look for a quick cure. So rather than, if a young man, he had smoked cannabis or has taken the balloons, the gas balloons, which is affecting his mind, rather than telling the parents that your young son, his mind is affected by the drugs that he is taking, what do these men of ta'aweedh do? They give them the ta'aweedh, or they blow upon them without even reciting Al-Quranul Kareem, and they ignore the medical advice. This is a recipe for failure. And then people become addicted to a quick fix. So these people will give false tasawwuf lectures. Some of them, what they do, some of these self-help gurus, non-Muslims, they copy their lectures. They actually go onto YouTube and copy the lectures of self-help gurus. And then those self-help gurus' lectures are given an Islamic packaging. And they give that out to the people. Sometimes people just need self-help. But what the peer will claim is that he is helping people through spiritual advice. In fact, he is actually catering for his murids through self-help lectures of Sadhguru and all these other false teachers that we have in this day and age. They in fact take that and repackage it with an Islamic packaging. So people, they take some of the psychotherapy sessions with these false guides, and then of course it becomes an addiction, and it becomes very difficult to remove anyone away from these cults. The only time they leave, many of them, they are forced to leave. They will be evicted out of the cult. Some of them may have a financial issue. There may be a financial issue within the cult. The peer may have been fleecing the murids for money, and some upset murids then will leave. Some of them will undergo violence. Some of the murids may become violent with a murid, so they are forced to leave. Some of them will undergo sexual abuse, or people they know will undergo sexual abuse and they are forced to leave. Very rarely does the penny drop for people. Very rarely does the penny drop. That is because ultimate hidayah is from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So, Every year we have people coming to this country, fleecing people, claiming to have shifa in their hands, claiming that they are touring this country for guidance, guiding people, when in reality very few of them actually even give da'wah to non-Muslims. Very few of them even approach non-Muslims within this country and actually convert those people to the deen of al-Islam. But because of the tarnished image of the peer culture, many people have resorted to the Najdi way as an alternative. They think the alternative is found in the Najdi way, when in reality, and I address everyone who is sincere, who wants to follow Al-Quran wa Sunnah ala nahji salafi salihin. You want to follow Al-Quran wa Sunnah on the way of the pious predecessors, then you follow one of the four Sunni schools. You adopt one of the four Sunni schools. That is the clear way of guidance.